People do not care about your game to the level that you do. Whether it's the math or the systems or the world and the setting and the lore, they are not as invested as you are in your game. So today we're going to be talking about 5 unintuitive or maybe unconventional tips that I've learned the hard way when building a tabletop role-playing game. So let's check them out one by one, and I hope that this helps people building their own games to stay on track. Think about your favorite moments from a tabletop role-playing game. Just anything recently, maybe even your last session. What was the coolest part, the most fun moment, the thing that you remembered the next day? My guess is that it wasn't how good the math was, or the nitty-gritty of which dice system was being used. You probably weren't even thinking about the dice system in comparison to others. You were thinking about the moments. All of the rules and numbers and systems in a tabletop role-playing game are there to create those moments. They're meant to facilitate that experience for everybody at the table. It doesn't work the other way around. You don't start with numbers and math and dice and see what moments they create. You need to start with the types of experiences you want and then decide on which systems, dice mechanics, and math will help bring you to those places. For example, a game like Masks probably asked itself, how could I create moments like Justice League or Teen Titans, right? They wanted to have the players feel like they were in the old Teen Titans show from the early 2000s. And so they asked themselves what sort of systems would allow them to create those moments. The teen drama combined with superhero adventure. And they obviously started from that evocation before wiring in all of their systems. So you should start with those moments and decide what you'd like before choosing your math. For Tales from Elsewhere games, I knew I wanted to have moments of action horror. I wanted movies like Aliens and Weird West things like Jonah Hex or Bone Tomahawk. I wanted chilling action and horror. And I wanted the players to feel that tension, to feel the noose tightening around their neck in any scenario, to feel like maybe they won't be able to make it out alive unless they band together and get out their guns and fend off the horrors. So I started there before attempting to add in systems. And this is because you're going to switch systems a lot. You're going to change the dice around, you're going to mess with things a lot during that process, but if you keep the moments that you'd like to create in mind, it'll keep you on track as you iterate. This one might be a hot take, but ignore character creation rules. Now I know a lot of people get really excited about character building and creating fun mechanics and systems that allow new players to make their characters in a system, but you actually don't want to start there. Instead, just think of what starting characters should be like after character creation. In a game like Dungeons & Dragons, you'd think about what should a level 1 character be able to do. Then you just build that. You just make those characters as pre-gens or work with your playtesters and run the tests of that. The reason for this is you're going to be changing your rules, changing maybe what the power level of a starting character may be, and you don't want to spend all of this time building out character creation rules in the meantime, because what will happen is your play testing will tell you if those characters are where they should be at level 1 or character creation. So don't bother refining a nuanced character creation rule set before you've done some sufficient playtesting. That's what we did for Tales from Elsewhere. We just built characters arbitrarily at first in sets and then ran them through significant testing. And that revealed what was interesting about those characters. And then you build character creation rules that give players access to those fun toys. You don't do it the other way around. No one cares about the math in your game. Now, I'm sure the math is good, and I'm sure you've researched it very well, and you've got it all modeled out, whether it's linear and bell curve, all these sort of decisions. But outside of maybe a tabletop design Discord that you hang out in, the people aren't going to care about that. You can't sell that to a prospective playtester as a reason to play your game. People that may be publishers or backers on crowdfunding, they're not going to engage with that on a really meaningful level. Instead, you focus on the vibe and the promise when trying to pitch that to other people. Now, the vibe is the setting, the evocation, the world you're trying to paint for people, that feeling of moments that you're going to try to give them. And the promise is what the product will be, all that it has to offer when it is done, regardless of when that is. That's much more evocative to people than just running through the mechanics and numbers of the game, which are important. But to be honest, you're not going to convince somebody to publish your game because of your mathematics spreadsheet. This was something that was also very painful for me as I was working on Tales from Elsewhere, because I was really into the math of it and I found it really interesting. And when I would be telling people about it, they would sort of glaze over because they don't really care. They didn't care about why I chose linear rather than bell curve. None of that really matters. It doesn't get anybody excited to sit down and try the game. It's just not interesting to them. But when I started talking about the post-apocalyptic Weird West setting that is in the first book, Clockworld, and about how the combat system is going to evoke things like the movie Aliens, all that stuff, that's more interesting. That's the vibe and the promise. Start talking about how cool the character creation will be when it's done, the types of characters you can make. All of that is way more interesting than the math. The math is not all that interesting to anybody but the dedicated designers, like maybe those of you watching this video right now. Now, this one might be the most obvious of these tips, but don't explain your rules to your testers. Don't actually sit down with them and tell them how to play the game. You write out the rules in whatever draft format you have, you slide the paper across the table to them, and get them to read it without your help. This is so incredibly informative. If you're there to explain and unpack everything to them, it won't reveal the ambiguities in your rules, the areas that aren't very clear, because you, as the creator, have ultimate system mastery. And you, of course, think everything is intuitive and obvious about your system, but let me tell you from personal experience, it is not always the case. I've learned so much about Tales from Elsewhere from just having people blindly read the rules and tell me if it made sense. And dollars to donuts, a lot of your designs will not make sense to a new reader, even people who are experienced in tabletop role-playing games, and they will tell you, and that will be invaluable. Listen to that feedback about what doesn't initially make sense. Maybe don't let them tell you how to change your game, but their initial confusion or lack of understanding of your rules is going to help so much in your writing and design. This was a very painful process for me working on Tales from Elsewhere. I spent too much time coaching and describing the rules to the players, and they were able to play the game just fine in the playtests. But then when I actually had the rules and wrote them and handed them to them, they were more confused than they were when I was explaining it, because my writing skills weren't up to snuff. I didn't have a good way to condense that down and transmit it to a player, and turns out I needed to work a lot on the rules structure and rules presentation, and I would have never learned that if I kept coaching them along the way. Okay, last one, pump the brakes on world building. I'm not saying don't world build, I'm not saying don't write, I'm just saying that you may be getting ahead of yourself if you're already 50 pages into lore and you haven't locked down how the game will even play yet. The lore will come, the lore will be there, but for testing purposes and building, no one has time to read your short story, your novella about your game world. You need to test mechanics and systems, not whether or not a reader finds your fiction palatable. That's a very different process, and I've seen people spend an inordinate amount of time just building lore, pages and pages and pages of it, and there's really no time for your testers to go through that realistically, so you're not going to even get good feedback on it because you need to still be building the system. And it's not to say you shouldn't be doing some writing and some fiction creating, but keep it simple, keep it organized, keep it more to notes rather than long form, at least initially. The drawback of focusing so much on lore is that you start to look like a failed novelist who is tricking people into reading their microfiction. And you don't want to be that person, right? You don't want to be the kind of person Zbashu makes a video about.
No, look, there's some cool mechanics in here, like the...
So instead, make sure the systems are sound before you inject too much lore into the writing, into the rules, into the playtest booklet that you're providing your testers, because there's just no room for that. It's not the appropriate place to be putting your energy especially early on. It's something you can certainly focus on at one point, but I know a lot of people flip through a book and ignore the pre-generated world that a game comes with and instead just want to make their own. And so you have to really balance how much of a book is going to be filled with setting and lore and history, because a non-negligible amount of people won't read it. It's not to say don't do it, but be realistic. If you are injecting a ton of lore into your book, do so in appropriate sections that people can skip if they need to. Don't make them dig through lore to find your rules. Keep these worlds separate. For Tales from Elsewhere, I kept the lore to just a page or two of major beats. What is the world? How did it get this way? Who are the major characters and groups and religions? But in brief, maybe just a paragraph or so for each of these. That way they can get a quick download on what the setting is supposed to be before hopping into a playtest. They could just take a few minutes to read that and they're set to jet. They don't need to go and thumb through a lot of pages. Now that the game is in a more stable place, I can sit down and I can write more long-form things. I plan on having a dedicated lore and world-building section in the book, but it's going to be its own chapter. People can ignore it if they want, but it'll all be there for those that do want to leverage it and all the detail and fun stuff that I've put in it. Well, I hope some of those tips were helpful for folks out there, even if there's just a handful of people that found them handy. That makes me happy. If this was useful to you, or if you have more tips you'd like to share for those working on tabletop role-playing games that may be unconventional, maybe you haven't seen other YouTubers mention it, definitely get down in the comments and let me know. I'm very active down there and I'll try to respond to all of them. We are gearing up to release free quick start rules. This will include how to play, pre-gen characters, and a demo adventure, a one-shot. It takes about 4 hours to complete. This will be provided free to the community for testing purposes, and we hope to have news of that in the coming weeks. So if you want to stay tuned, definitely subscribe. All right, hope to see you on the next video.